My entire family tried to cut me out of my grandfather's life and his will, only to discover that I was the only person named in it. Before I tell you how a single video recording in a locked leather briefcase turned their world upside down, do me a favor and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always good to know who's listening out there. I'm Daniel Granger, 34 years old, and it all kicked off on a crisp Tuesday morning in October, the kind of morning where the air feels so fresh it almost stings your lungs, and the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves hints that winter is just around the corner. I was in my workshop, a converted garage behind my small rented house, surrounded by the organized chaos of my craft. The sharp, sweet smell of freshly cut oak mixed with wood stain filled the space. I'm a carpenter, building furniture the old-fashioned way. No particle board, no shortcuts, just solid wood, clever joints, and a firm belief that good things are meant to last. At that moment, I was working on a rocking chair, carefully shaping the curve of the runner with a spokeshave, watching thin shavings curl up and fall to the floor. It was quiet work, almost meditative, and I liked it that way. My life was intentionally simple. I'd wake up with the sun, work until my back ached, then head home to my small apartment above the workshop. I'd make a simple dinner, read a book, then fall asleep. My old Toyota pickup had more rust than paint, but the engine still ran reliably. I was just barely getting by financially. But after everything that had happened over the past 6 months, even just getting by felt like an enormous win. My phone vibrated on the workbench, bumping against a stack of sandpaper and kicking up a fine dust cloud. I sighed, wiped my hands on the front of my canvas apron, and picked up the call, a number I didn't recognize. The message was short and cold. "Mr. Daniel Granger, your presence is required at the reading of Franklin Granger's last will and testament. 2 p.m. today. Whittaker and Associates. Urgent." I read it once, then again, my chest tightening with each read. Franklin Granger, my grandfather, had been gone for 3 weeks now. 3 weeks of deafening silence from the people I was supposed to call family. 3 weeks during which I was systematically erased, quietly and efficiently, from every announcement, every gathering, every whispered plan. They had made it clear, I no longer existed to them. So why now? Why this? My first instinct was to think it was some kind of prank, a twisted joke, or maybe my younger brothers Lucas and Aaron messing with me again. It had their fingerprints all over it, kicking a guy when he's already down and then laughing about it later. I spent the next few hours in a fog, my hands going through the motions of sanding the armrest of the rocking chair, while my mind was miles away, stuck replaying the last 6 months, the shouting matches, the venomous accusations, and that brutal final break that felt more like an amputation than family falling apart. At 1:45 p.m. I found myself parked across from the law office, my truck's engine ticking as it cooled down. Whittaker and Associates was housed in a beautifully renovated Gennan building on Main Street, one of those places meant to make you feel safe and respected. To me, it looked more like the final courtroom where my fate would be decided. I almost turned the key to drive away, go back to my workshop, back to quiet work and simple routines. But then I heard my grandfather's voice in my head, faint but clear, the last real conversation we had: "See it through, son. No matter what." I took a deep breath, the air tasted cold and sharp like steel, and then I got out of the truck. Walking up the stone path, my worn work boots felt clumsy and loud on the sleek slate steps. As my hand reached for that heavy, polished oak door, I could hear voices behind it, through thick wood walls, my father's voice loud and confident. "We already divided everything," Charles boomed, sounding triumphant. "Dad's watches, the house, the investments, you weren't invited for a reason." My blood went cold. Without hesitation, I pushed open the door. Inside, the conference room was packed with them, an assembly of predators dressed in expensive suits and fancy dress shirts. Charles sat at the head of a long mahogany table, taking on what he clearly thought was his rightful role as head of the family. My mother, Margaret, sat beside him clutching a leather-bound folder as if it were some kind of treasure. My brothers Lucas and Aaron were smirking at their phones, probably already spending their inheritance without a second thought. My sister-in-law Jenna was sitting nearby, studying her nails with total boredom plastered on her face. When I entered, they all looked up, shifting through a quick rotation of shock, disgust, and outright anger across their faces. What in God's name is he doing here? Lucas spat out loudly, jumping up so quickly his chair screeched against the hardwood floor. Security guards were standing nearby, clearly ready to step in if needed. Before I could even find the words to respond, a calm, authoritative presence suddenly cut through the tense, toxic atmosphere in the room. Mr. Whitaker, my grandfather's lawyer, and kind-looking man in his 70s with eyes that seemed to have seen everything, stood up from his seat at the table. I invited him, Mr. Granger, he said, gazing directly at my father. His presence isn't just allowed, it's actually essential for today's proceedings. The room instantly fell into complete silence, and in that quiet, I noticed a new emotion flicker across their faces, an emotion I hadn't seen on them in a long time. It wasn't just anger or annoyance, it was genuine cold fear. The unspoken question hung thick in the air, almost suffocating: why on earth was I so important? To really understand the raw fear that suddenly gripped that conference room, you have to go back 6 months, to what my family now calls the Thanksgiving incident. Our family Thanksgivings were never about gratitude, they were more like a performance, a carefully orchestrated play directed by my mother, Margaret. She'd bring out the finest china and silverware that only saw use once a year, and she'd cook a meal worthy of a magazine cover. The guest list was always meticulously chosen to include people she wanted to impress. It was all about keeping up the perfect facade of the Granger family, wealthy, happy, successful, and deeply respectable. But I knew the truth beneath all that shine. Beneath the surface, the foundation was rotten. That year, I finally reached a point where I couldn't sit at that table and swallow one more bite of hypocrisy. The guests were always the same familiar faces, plus my great-aunt Agnes, Grandpa's older sister. She was a quiet, bird-like woman who rarely spoke but had sharp eyes that missed nothing. She sat in the corner, nursing a small glass of cherry, just observing everything. My father, Charles, was holding court at the head of the table, his voice booming as he bragged about his latest investment opportunities that were supposed to be foolproof. He ran a financial advisory firm called Granger and Sons Capital, a grand name for what was really just a one-man operation running out of a rented office space. I knew what it truly was, a predator targeting the elderly and trusting folks, people who had spent their whole lives building up their savings. People just like his dad's friends in their retirement community. He'd dazzle them with complicated charts and false promises of impossible returns, then churn their accounts for commissions or push them into high-risk ventures that would inevitably crash, leaving them with pennies on the dollar. That night, he was gloating about how Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey, our old neighbors, were doing. The Ramseys had been like second grandparents to me growing up. My father announced proudly, swirling his red wine in his glass, "They're absolutely thrilled. We've nearly doubled their investment in just 6 months. They're finally looking at that condo down in Florida." A hot wave of metallic rage flooded through me. I'd seen Mrs. Ramsey just the week before at the grocery store. She looked a decade older than she should be, shoulders slumped in defeat as she carefully counted her change to buy generic soup. She didn't look like someone planning a vacation home, she looked terrified of her next utility bill. I put my fork down sharply on my plate, the loud clink of silver on porcelain cut through all the chatter around us. Every eye turned toward me. My father's practiced smile faltered just a bit. "What is it, Daniel?" "That's not true," I said quietly, but my words hit like a grenade right in the middle of the table. Charles's face started to turn a dangerous shade of purple. "What did you just say to me?" he demanded. "That's a lie," I repeated, raising my voice slightly now, gaining strength. My fists clenched beneath the table, knuckles turning white. I looked straight at their son, Ben, who told me they'd lost nearly everything, had to take out a reverse mortgage just to keep going. "The house you grew up next to, Dad, the one where they used to give you cookies and milk after school." "You don't know a damn thing about my business," he snarled. "You're just a carpenter, you work with your hands because you're too stupid to handle money. Without thinking, I shot back what had been building inside me for years: you're nothing but a thief in a $1,000 suit, stealing from your neighbors. My mother immediately jumped into action, her acting skills on full display, her voice filled with a mix of authority and hurt. "Daniel, that's enough," she commanded. "This isn't the time or place. You're upsetting our guests and ruining Thanksgiving for everyone." She started spinning her story, painting me as an unstable, ungrateful son throwing a tantrum and causing a scene. But I pushed back hard. "No, this is the perfect time and place," I insisted, glaring at her. "We're all just sitting here pretending to be this perfect God-fearing family. Let's talk about God for a minute. Mom, remember that church fundraiser you were treasurer for? How did $29,000 from the youth center building fund just disappear without a trace? Pastor Caldwell told me they had to shut down the after-school program because of some clerical mistake. Was that mistake really just the down payment on your new Lexus?" Margaret's calm, composed facade finally broke for a split second. I saw a flash of pure, scaly anger in her eyes before she quickly masked it with a theatrical look of devastation. "How could you?" she whispered, a tear sliding perfectly down her cheek. My brother Lucas, always loyal, shot to his feet. "You're completely out of line, Mike. You've always envied Dad's success, sitting in your dusty workshop while he built an empire." "Success?" I let out a bitter, ugly laugh, the kind that claws its way out of your throat. "You call this success? Let's talk about your version of success, Lucas. What about the thousands of dollars in charges from offshore gambling sites on Grandpa's credit card? You really think an 82-year-old man suddenly took up online poker? He knows what you're up to, idiot. He just doesn't want to accept it." I turned to my other brother, Aaron, who was trying to become invisible at the far end of the table. "And you, Aaron, running your little drug-dealing side hustle out of Grandpa's garage. He's old, but he's not stupid. He knows that strange sweet smell isn't fertilizer for his roses." It was like an all-out demolition. I threw every rotten secret I knew right into the harsh light of that dining room. I looked around at my so-called family, stunned, hateful, and terrified faces staring back at me. Then my gaze landed on Grandpa. He sat there silently, fork resting on his plate, untouched food before him. He looked ancient, with all color drained from his face. But he wasn't angry or disappointed in me. Instead, he looked at me with a deep, earth-shattering sadness. He understood I was telling the truth, and it was breaking his heart. In the corner, I saw my great-aunt Agnes carefully set her sherry glass down and stare down at her folded hands in her lap. She refused to meet my eyes. She knew too, and her silence spoke volumes, another quiet confirmation. That moment marked the end of my life as a Granger. I was physically thrown out of the house. My dad yelled at me from the front lawn, his face twisted in rage, telling me I was dead to him. My mom stood in the doorway, crying theatrically for the neighbor's benefit, saying I had broken her heart and shamed the family. The days afterward felt like a masterclass in erasure. Lucas posted a long, self-pitying rant on Facebook about how toxic and mentally unstable his brother was and how the family was finally doing the necessary surgery, cutting out the cancer. Dozens of sympathetic comments poured in. I was blocked everywhere, my calls went straight to voicemail. A few days later, I tried to visit Grandpa just to apologize for how everything went down, for causing such a scene. Before I could even ring the bell, Margaret answered at the door, her face a cold mask of fake concern mixed with fury. "He's resting, Daniel," she said, blocking the doorway with her body. "You've caused enough trouble. He's an old man, he doesn't need this stress. It's better if you stay away." Then came the official legal blow, my restraining order. I got served the papers at my workshop by a sheriff's deputy who looked like he didn't want to be there. The document was full of lies, claiming I was unstable, aggressive, and a threat to Grandpa. They twisted my desperate pleas into threats of violence, an outright character assassination wrapped up as law. A few days before I got served, I called Grandpa's private line repeatedly until he finally answered. He sounded exhausted. "Don't let them dim your light," he whispered, voice cracking with emotion I couldn't quite place. "Son," he said softly, "sometimes the black sheep is the only one who isn't a wolf." Then I heard my mother's sharp, angry voice in the background, and the line went dead. I found out Grandpa had passed away 3 weeks before that day in the lawyer's office. I read it in the obituary online. No call, no message, just some sterile public notice. The funeral was private, for close family only. I wasn't considered immediate family anymore. Later, I saw pictures posted by my sister-in-law Jenna with the hashtag #FamilyFirst, the whole clan dressed in black, looking somber and unified in their grief. My own grief didn't seem to matter, my love for Grandpa didn't count either. I'd become the outcast, the villain in the story they all agreed to tell about themselves. I used to sneak out late at night, long after the gates were shut, and stand by the freshly dug grave beneath a lonely oak tree. I'd talk to him softly, telling him I was sorry for the fight, sorry for the distance, and sorry I couldn't be there to hold his hand when he passed. I genuinely thought I had broken his heart, that he had gone believing I was a bitter, hateful person. I bought into their lies completely, convinced they had already won. So, sitting there in that suffocating conference room with my family's hostile gazes burning into me, all I could feel was a deep, swirling confusion. My father, sitting at the head of the table, had called me a disgrace. The woman beside him, my mother, had lied to a judge to keep me away from him. My brothers wished I didn't exist. And yet, here I was, according to the family lawyer, still essential. My father, ever the pragmatist, was the first to recover. He let out a brief, dismissive laugh that lacked any humor at all. "Essential? Mr. Whitaker, I believe you're mistaken. Daniel has no claim here." My father was very clear about how he felt toward him at the end, disappointed and let down. He even added, while patting the folder his wife was guarding, that they'd already handled distributing his personal effects privately as a family to honor his true wishes. "Is that so?" Mr. Whitaker responded, his voice steady, dangerous even, as if he was holding back anger. He refused to meet my father's gaze. Instead, he looked at me, and for the first time that day, I felt a tiny flicker of something other than dread or sorrow, almost like a spark of hope. The room felt heavy with unspoken threats and the thick scent of my mother's expensive perfume lingering in the air. My father, Charles, leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the polished mahogany table as if staking his claim over it and the entire situation. His shiny gold cufflinks caught the recessed lighting as he did so. "Mr. Whitaker, let's not waste any more time with this drama," he said in a low, commanding tone, like he was about to close a deal with someone unsuspecting. "We're the grieving family here." He jerked his chin in my direction with contempt. "He's an outsider now. Whatever small bequest my father may have left him out of some misguided last-minute pity can be mailed to him, no need to drag this out. Now, if you'd be so kind as to proceed with the official will you have on file, the one everyone knows about, we can put an end to this unfortunate matter." He was trying to control how everything was unfolding, just like he'd done in life, steamrolling everyone around him. He probably assumed the old will from 5 years ago, which split everything equally among me, Lucas, and Aaron, was still valid. He likely thought my share would be declared forfeit or that they'd push me out somehow. Mr. Whitaker shook his head slowly and deliberately. "No. That's not going to happen." The casual way he used my father's first name without any honorifics was a subtle but powerful way of asserting dominance and making Charles flinch. "The will you're talking about, the one dated May 12, 2020, was officially revoked and replaced. Mr. Granger drew up a new last will and testament 6 weeks ago." Hearing that timeline hit like a punch in the stomach, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. My mother, Margaret, was the first to find her voice again. It lost its usual smoothness and turned sharp and brittle, as if cracking ice underneath her words. "That's impossible," she declared stiffly, her posture rigid as if determined to stand her ground. Father wasn't himself near the end, he was confused and suffering from dementia, she said it like she was unveiling some legal trump card or final proof. Just last month, he got agitated and called me Lillian, mistaking me for his own mother. The poor guy was so lost in his mind. Any document signed so recently has to be the result of manipulation or at least severe mental decline, it won't stand up in court. Her words came out with a pained concern that almost convinced me, except I knew my grandmother's name was Rose, not Lillian. Dementia, that word tasted like ash in my mouth when I said it aloud. That's funny though, I remember just last month he was on a video call with me before you blocked my number. He was teaching me some complicated joinery technique he'd read about in Fine Woodworking magazine, and drawing diagrams to show me. He even did the New York Times crossword in pen every morning without fail and had beaten me at online chess just 2 months ago. My brother Lucas sneered from across the table with an expression full of arrogant disdain. How would you know anything? You weren't there. Oh wait, you couldn't be because of the restraining order. We were the ones taking care of him, changing his diapers, managing his episodes. That's another lie. Grandpa had been fiercely independent until the very end. The only diapers in that house belonged to Lucas's own infant son. I shot back, a restraining order you got by lying to a judge, my voice rising with a frustration I couldn't hold back. He told me he was trying to help me fight that very order. Enough, Mr. Whitaker said calmly, yet with a quiet authority that sliced through our arguing like a hot knife through butter. He unzipped a sleek, dark leather briefcase placed on the table and took out a thick, sealed manila envelope along with a thinner document. Mr. Granger's mental capacity is not and will not be in question during these proceedings, he stated. He was an incredibly meticulous man who anticipated exactly this kind of argument. With grace, Margaret pushed the thinner document across the table. It came to rest directly in front of my father. This is a copy of a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation done by Dr. Alistair Lang, the head of neurology at University Hospital, he explained. Dr. Lang is widely recognized as the top expert in this field in our state. He added that the evaluation was performed on the very day the new will was signed right here in this room. And I will quote the conclusion for the record, Mr. Whitaker continued, Mr. Franklin Granger was of exceptionally sound mind, had full testamentary capacity, and was under no pressure or undue influence whatsoever. I saw my mother's face drain of all color as if she'd seen a ghost, while my father stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake coiled in front of him. This was their entire legal gambit, their main attack plan, and Mr. Whitaker had just expertly, calmly, and surgically dismantled it before they could even begin. Margaret, ever the manipulator, quickly tried to change tactics. A piece of paper from a doctor who saw him for just an hour doesn't mean anything, she insisted. We were with him every single day. We saw him decline, he became paranoid, started having delusions. He even told me squirrels were spies for the government. He probably thought Daniel was someone else, a long-lost army buddy, maybe. But Mr. Whitaker interrupted her, his tone still gentle but now edged with unmistakable impatience. Actually, he was so worried that his final wishes might be challenged that he took an extraordinary step, he said softly, letting his words hang in the tense silence of the room. Then, reaching into his briefcase, he pulled out a small, slim laptop and left a video message. If his previous statement had been a surgical strike, this was a bunker-busting bomb. A collective gasp rippled through my family, and Jenna, my perpetually bored sister-in-law, actually dropped her phone with a loud clatter on the table. Charles stammered in shock, his carefully maintained bravado cracking apart to reveal the panicked man beneath. "What in God's name is this nonsense?" he asked. "It's not nonsense," Mr. Whitaker replied calmly, opening the laptop and turning it so everyone could see the screen. "This is his sworn, notarized testimony, recorded with a court-certified stenographer present as a witness, where he wanted to speak to you all one last time." He paused for effect before adding, he wanted to make his intentions perfectly clear, irrevocably clear, so there would be no confusion. The cracks in their united front started to show visibly. Lucas shot a dark glance at his father and muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "I told you we should have gotten our own doctor." My brother Aaron, who'd been silent until then, finally found his voice, shaky and tinged with growing panic. "You can't do this. This is a private family matter. It's an invasion of our privacy." "It's cruel," he insisted. Mr. Whittaker held up his hand slightly, with his finger hovering over the laptop trackpad. "On the contrary," he said softly but firmly, "your father considered this final act of family transparency, the ultimate effort to bring the truth into the open. It was clear he was playing them now, he had all the power and was letting them squirm in their own lies and manipulations. For decades, they'd been the ones controlling everything, the rules, the reality, the narrative, and now they found themselves trapped in this plain beige conference room, about to be judged by the very man they thought they had silenced and manipulated into submission. My mother made one last desperate attempt to stop what was coming. She stood up straight, trying to look like a wronged, grieving matriarch, the picture of dignity gone wrong. "Mr. Whittaker," she said pleadingly, "as the family matriarch, I must insist, this is undignified. It's ghoulish and an invasion of his memory." Her voice trembled as she insisted that whatever was on that video must be just the ramblings of a sick old man, a paranoid delusional who didn't know what he was saying anymore, and that it should be handled with respect and decency instead of turning it into some grotesque spectacle. Whittaker looked up at her, his gentle eyes now hardened and as unyielding as pieces of solid granite. "Your son Daniel was right, Margaret, your husband, during his last months, was many things, disappointed, heartbroken, and deeply, profoundly saddened. But he was not an old man who was sick. Instead, he was a father and grandfather who finally faced the raw, unfiltered truth. And he wanted to make sure you saw it as well." With that thought in mind, he pressed play. The screen flickered on, bringing to life an image I knew better than my own reflection. Yet, it felt different. This was my grandfather, Franklin Granger, but stripped of all pretenses. He sat in his favorite armchair in his study, the one with the cracked leather and that familiar smell of pipe tobacco mixed with old paper. The rich, dark wood of his bookshelves, filled with history books and classics, framed him like a portrait. He appeared tired, yes, and thinner than I'd last seen him, the skin stretched tight over his proud cheekbones, yet his eyes were sharp and piercingly clear. There was a weary, resolute fire burning in them that seemed to cut right through the screen, reaching into the room. He wore the thick cable-knit fisherman sweater I'd gifted him for Christmas 2 years earlier, the same one my mother had casually said he'd thrown out because it was too scratchy and wasn't his style. Just another one of those countless small lies they told to create a wall between us. His voice filled the room, not weak or shaky as they claimed but steady and commanding, resonating with the quiet authority he had always carried. It was the voice of a man who had made peace with mortality and had one final, urgent message to deliver. "Hello, everyone," he began, his eyes seeming to look straight through the camera, making individual contact with each person sitting at the table. "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone. I imagine you're all gathered there looking pretty sad. I hope the food's up to your standards, Margaret." My mother flinched as if he'd struck her physically, an expertly aimed low blow. "I wasn't recording this to say a tearful goodbye," he continued, with a grim, determined set to his jaw. "I've already said my farewells to those who truly mattered to me. I'm doing this for clarity, for truth, because honesty has been a foreign language in this family for way too long." He shifted slightly in his chair, his gaze locking onto the camera lens and holding it steadily. "First and foremost, I want to speak directly to my grandson, Daniel." My breath caught in my throat, an instant sensation as if every molecule of air had been sucked out of the room. Every eye around the table shifted to me, heavy with anxiety and resentment, fixating on my presence. "Daniel, son," he said softly, easing his tone just for a moment, a wave of genuine warmth washing over me and pushing aside the cold fear I'd felt inside. "I know they've kept you away from me. I know what they've told you about yourself. I know about the restraining order and the vicious lies they spun to get it approved by a judge. I want you to hear this from me directly, and I want everyone here to listen." His voice grew more serious. "You were the only one brave enough to tell me the truth, even if it meant risking their hatred. You were the only one who dared do what was right. And they punished you for it, they tried to break you down and make you think you were crazy. He paused for a moment, taking a deliberate sip of water from a glass beside him. The room was silent, only broken by the sound of him swallowing and the shallow, frantic breathing of my family members trapped there with him. They had no choice but to listen to the words of someone no longer alive. "Forgive an old man for not speaking up sooner," he said softly, voice thick with genuine regret. "I was weak, I was in denial. It's hard to admit that the people you raised and built your life around are capable of such deep corruption. You opened my eyes, son. That last Thanksgiving, that was my final wake-up call." My grandfather let out a bitter laugh, dazed and strained. "My father couldn't take it anymore," he said quietly. "He's lost his mind." It was as if he was trying to prove his own sanity while exposing what was really going on behind the scenes, that Daniel had poisoned his mind against his own flesh and blood, that this whole thing was just an act, a performance carefully coached by my father. For 6 months, I'd stayed silent, I'd absorbed their accusations, their slander, their hatred. I let them define me as the villain in their story. But hearing my grandfather's words from beyond the grave, his validation, something inside me shifted. The fear and confusion that had been gnawing at me for weeks started to burn away, replaced by something firm and unshakable, resolve. I looked across the table, not at the screen but directly at my father. He cared about truth, I could see that in his eyes. "Dad," I said quietly but with unwavering conviction that filled the silent room, "I only ever told him the truth. Maybe that's what you and everyone else here couldn't stand, living in a world of lies for so long that you can't even recognize the truth when it's right in front of you." I then shifted my gaze and nodded toward the laptop, signaling that I was ready to hear the rest of his story. "Please go on, Mr. Whitaker," I said. Mr. Whitaker responded with a small, almost unnoticeable nod, silent approval of the power shift, before refocusing on the screen. Grandpa's expression turned grim once more, the brief warmth replaced by a cold, fiery anger fueled by righteousness. "They called you jealous, Daniel," he said. "They claimed you couldn't stand seeing them succeed. So, let's talk about that success now, shall we?" His eyes narrowed, and he seemed to find a dark pleasure in this grim sort of way. "It wasn't just your warnings I listened to, Daniel. I started digging for facts after you opened my eyes. An old man with time and money in the bank can uncover a lot of things," I discovered. I hired professionals to help me dig deeper. A new, chilling fear began to spread across my family's faces. This wasn't just sentimental talk anymore, it was a formal accusation. "Charles," Grandpa's voice lowered, and my father flinched as if hit by a whip crack. "Let's talk about your business," he said. "Let's discuss the Ramseys and the Hamiltons, even poor Mrs. Gable from down the street, all friends who trusted you, my son. I have copies of their financial statements, actual ones, down to the penny. I know exactly how much they invested and how much they lost." Then Grandpa turned his sharp digital gaze toward Margaret, my devout daughter-in-law and treasurer of the Methodist Church Fund, so respected in our community. $30,000, that precise number, also happens to be the exact amount you paid in cash for that luxury SUV just 2 weeks after the church funds went missing. Car dealerships keep detailed records of large cash transactions. Trust me, the IRS keeps a close eye on those. My mother let out a small choking sound, her hand flying instinctively to her pearl necklace. Grandpa pressed on relentlessly, like a force of nature. "Lucas, my golden grandson who always seemed more successful than his older brother, gambling debts are terrible enough, son. But it's even worse when you're paying them off with 3 high-interest credit cards taken out in your 82-year-old grandfather's name. That's considered identity theft, son, and those credit card companies have entire departments dedicated to prosecuting it." Lucas looked like he was about to be physically ill, his face turned a sickly green, and he was sweating heavily. "And Aaron," Grandpa said softly but with a tone filled with deep weariness, "I've always wondered about that strange, sweet chemical smell in my garage. I thought it was just a leaky lawnmower or some old paint cans. Turns out, it was your little distribution center. I may be an old man, Aaron, but I can still tell the difference between fertilizer and fentanyl. The smell of each is unmistakable. The room no longer felt silent, it was filled with gasps and shaky breaths, panic creeping in. My family, the proud Grangers who always seemed untouchable, was starting to fall apart right here in this sterile beige conference room. The entire foundation of their lives, built on secrets, cruelty, and lies, was crumbling before my eyes, and my grandfather was wielding the sledgehammer. From his armchair on the screen, Grandpa wasn't finished yet. His image seemed to grow larger in stature, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment as he tied up all the loose ends of this messy, painful story. He focused on wrapping things up before he was done. Turning to the rest of the room, the supporting players in this family drama, he spoke calmly but with an edge that made it even more terrifying. "Jenna," he said softly but firmly, my sister-in-law, who had been trying to disappear into her expensive silk blouse, froze as if struck by a stun gun. "You were always so worried about my health and well-being, especially when you kept visiting that handsome young caretaker I hired last year during your lunch breaks so often. The security cameras in his building's lobby and elevator are crystal clear, I saw them myself, and I was deeply disappointed by what I found. That's why I had to let him go." Jenna's face turned shockingly white. She didn't gasp or cry, she just sat there, like a porcelain doll whose strings had been cut. My brother Lucas, her husband, slowly turned his head toward her. The look on his face wasn't one of hurt or betrayal, it was pure cold venom. Their fake marriage was unraveling right alongside the smoldering ruins of our family's finances and reputation. "And Howard Linda," he said, his gaze shifting toward my uncle and aunt, who were huddled in the corner like frightened mice. "Your secret whispers in my kitchen, talking about how my house could sell for a good price on the market. About which nursing home had the fewest complaints and wouldn't drain the inheritance too quickly. I'm old, sure, but I hear everything, especially when you think I'm napping in my chair." They lowered their eyes, their faces burning with a mixture of shame and exposure, an ugly, uncomfortable blend. They'd been caught red-handed, plotting to get rid of him like he was some inconvenient piece of furniture. Finally, he shifted his gaze to my cousin Crystal, the family gossip. "Crystal, my dear, I know my heart medication is costly, but stealing them from my cabinet during your weekly visits and then reselling them to your friends, well, that's a pretty enterprising side hustle, though technically illegal. You should be more cautious, though. Your fingerprints are all over those half-empty bottles my private investigator collected from the trash, an obvious, careless mistake that could land you in serious legal trouble." Crystal let out a dramatic sob and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling. Grandpa leaned back in his chair on the screen, letting out a long, exhausted shuddering sigh. It was the kind of sigh a man gives after carrying a terrible burden for too long. "Daniel was the only one," he said softly, his voice now tinged with deep sorrow. "The only one who loved me more than my bank account, who saw me as a person, not just an ATM or a stepping stone to bigger things like a nicer house or a fancier car." He paused, voice trembling with emotion. "He brought me books and conversation, not schemes to make money or sob stories. He told the truth, and you tried to wipe him out for it. You shut him out. You slandered his name. You turned me against the one person in this whole family who still has a soul." He leaned forward one last time, his eyes piercing into the camera with such intensity it felt like he was right there in the room with us. So when it came to choosing who should carry on the Granger name with integrity and honor, it was a no-brainer, very simple. The video cut off. The screen went black, leaving the room stunned into silence that seemed to echo loudly. Mr. Whitaker let that silence hang for about 10 seconds before he finally spoke again, his voice calm but clear. "And that," he said, picking up a thick manila envelope from the table, "brings us to the will itself." He broke the wax seal with a crisp snap that made everyone jump. Carefully, he unfolded the heavy document inside and cleared his throat. "I, Franklin Granger, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this my last will and testament." He read through the opening legal language in a steady, even tone amid the tense atmosphere. Everyone sat motionless, waiting for the hammer to drop. Then he moved on to the specifics of the inheritance. To my son Charles Granger, he read coldly, I leave him all of his glossy company brochures that I saved from his office trash. May they serve as evidence in the federal investigation into his business practices, which I have taken the liberty of reporting anonymously to the SEC. Charles let out a choking noise, like someone being strangled, an unmistakable sign that his entire world, reputation, and freedom were crumbling. Next came Margaret Granger. He continued smoothly, I leave behind the empty velvet collection plate from her church. I retrieved it after a Sunday service, and a sealed letter to be delivered this afternoon by courier to Pastor Caldwell about her missing $30,000 building fund and her recent car purchase. Margaret's mouth moved silently, like a fish gasping on dry land, her carefully built world of respectability and social standing shattered in an instant. For my grandson Lucas Granger, he left pamphlets on gambling addiction along with a fully paid, non-refundable 1-month stay at the Fallen Leaf Recovery Center in Arizona. I genuinely hope he uses it. The credit card companies he defrauded have already been notified by my office. And for Aaron Granger, I leave all the tools in my garage since he spends so much time there productively, plus, a business card and a $5,000 retainer for a top-notch criminal defense lawyer. He'll definitely need it. He continued down the list, each bequest a precisely aimed missile of justice. For Jenna, a high-resolution copy of security footage from her lover's apartment building. For Howard and Linda, unedited recordings of their conversations in his kitchen. For Crystal, proof of her prescription theft, ready to be handed over to the police if needed. Then Mr. Whitaker paused briefly to take a sip of water. He looked straight at me, and for the first time, a faint smile brushed his lips. Finally, he spoke, his voice warming with real joy. To my grandson, Daniel Granger, who's the only one brave enough to be honest and kind, I leave everything else. The room went silent, hanging on his words. Everything else? Aaron asked sharply, his voice rough and croaky. What the hell do you mean by everything else? Mr. Whitaker pulled out a summary sheet attached to the will and explained. He clarified that, everything else, covers my main house on Cedar Street along with all its furnishings, all my bank accounts, stock portfolios, investment funds, the entire Granger family trust, my vintage car collection, and the contents of 4 separate safe deposit boxes at First National Bank. The will also states that Daniel is the sole beneficiary of all my life insurance policies and retirement savings. How much? Charles growled loudly, his face turning a blotchy purple that looked almost terrifying. It seemed like he was about to have a stroke. Just tell us the damn number, Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker looked down at his paper for a moment, then raised his eyes, peering over his wire-rimmed glasses directly at my father. He said that as of yesterday's market close, the total value of the estate is roughly $5. 8 million. That was it, the dam of civility burst completely. It shattered into 1,000 pieces in an instant. Chaos erupted with wild intensity. Charles lunged across the table toward me, letting out a guttural roar fueled by rage, his face twisted with murderous anger. Surprisingly quick and steady despite his age, Mr. Whitaker stepped in to stop him, placing a firm hand on Charles's chest. Water glasses tipped over, spilling ice and water onto the polished table. Lucas, in a fit of helpless fury, threw his phone against the wall. It shattered into fragments of glass and plastic. Margaret was now openly crying, but not out of grief. Her sobs were born from the raw, ugly pain of losing everything financially. We're going to fight this, Charles shouted through clenched teeth, struggling against Mr. Whitaker's grip. It's undue influence, elder abuse, he wasn't even competent anymore. We'll drag this out in court for years. Mr. Whitaker stayed calm in a way that was almost unsettling. I strongly advise against doing that, he said firmly, cutting through the tense atmosphere. He motioned with his free hand toward the locked leather briefcase sitting on the table, which until now had been forgotten amid the chaos. Like I mentioned earlier, your father was a very meticulous man. He had anticipated this reaction from them. He called this his insurance policy. Tapping the top of the briefcase with his finger, he explained, inside this case is every piece of evidence my private investigator collected over the past 6 months, every damaging financial statement, each surveillance photo, every unedited audio recording, and sworn affidavits from those you've wronged. It's all here, carefully organized and cross-referenced. My father's instructions in the will are clear and legally binding. The moment any of you tries to challenge it, filing a lawsuit or contest, the entire contents of this briefcase will be duplicated and sent by courier to the district attorney's office, the SEC, IRS, and even the state medical board. Not just the FBI, Charles, I mean the local district attorney who's up for re-election next year and would love to make a big splash by proving a prominent local family exploited the elderly and got caught. The room fell silent once again. But this time, it wasn't shock or anticipation filling the space, it was heavy, oppressive silence that felt like defeat itself. The kind of silence that signals a trap closing for good with brutal finality. They had been caught, not just disinherited but exposed, vulnerable, and completely ruined. Their secrets were now hostage to the very will they wanted to fight so badly. Their greed had been what baited them into this trap, set by their own father from beyond the grave. They stared at that briefcase like it was a live bomb ready to go off. The dark brown leather looked almost sinister under the light, shining with an ominous glow. It was more than just a case, it was a literal Pandora's box of their crimes sitting right there between us. The air around us thickened with their fear almost palpable. My own voice sounded strange, rusty and raw, when I finally managed to speak. "I don't want it," I said softly, quieter than I'd expected. "Not like this. Not with threats." Every person at the table turned to look at me instantly. Their faces, once filled with defeated anger, shifted into new masks of desperate calculation. In their minds, I had suddenly become their last hope, maybe even their only way out of this mess. "Don't you dare," my father hissed sharply, his voice trembling with venomous warning. He had slumped back into his chair like a broken man. "Don't even think about playing the hero now after everything you've done. This was your plan from the very beginning. You manipulated an ailing old man and turned him against his own family." I told him the truth, simply and honestly, words that felt more solid and genuine than anything else in that room, something none of you had done in years. I didn't come up with a plan, I just spoke the truth. Mr. Whitaker, seeing how the conversation was unfolding, gracefully slid a slim, personal envelope across the table toward me. It was crafted from heavy cream-colored paper, with my name, Daniel, written on the front in my grandfather's familiar, elegant handwriting. "Your grandfather thought you might feel conflicted, Daniel," the lawyer said softly. "He left a letter just for my eyes." My hands trembled as I reached out and took it. The paper felt worn, almost as if it still carried some of his life force. I broke the seal, unfolded the single page, and started reading. "My dearest Daniel, if you're reading this, it means the vultures have finally been put in their place. I know your heart is the kindest and strongest part of this entire family, son. Somehow, you inherited all of it. I understand you're sitting there right now feeling guilty, probably thinking about fairness, about giving them yet another chance to disappoint you. That's why I love you. But listen to an old man who's had plenty of time to think, they've had their chances. Every holiday, birthday, and Sunday dinner was another opportunity for them to be better, more honest, more kind. Instead, they chose to worsen. They chose greed over grace, cruelty over compassion. And when you finally stood up for what's right, they didn't just disagree, they tried to destroy you. They tried to paint you as a monster to hide their own monstrosity. Never forget, this money isn't about revenge. I want you to understand this deep down in your bones, it's protection. It's freedom. It's a tool. It's my way of saying thank you, not for the money, but for visiting me because you loved me, not my bank account. Thank you for bringing books and conversation instead of schemes and sob stories. Thank you for having the courage to be the man I always hoped my own son would become. The most important thing I'm leaving you isn't the cash, son, it's a clean slate. An opportunity to live a good life, full, honest, and free from their poison. Your only obligation is to be happy. But I do have one request, a dying wish. If you'd indulge an old man, don't let their evil be the final chapter in the Granger family story. Use these resources to become the conscience of this family. That's what your father should have been. Use what I've left to right their many wrongs. Start that veteran support center you always talked about. Help those they've hurt. Build something good and lasting from the wreckage they left behind. With all my love, Grandpa. P.S. The house now has a new security system, and the locks have been changed, they don't have the code anymore. Tears blurred the words as he wrote them. I knew him so well. He knew that guilt would be the first thing I'd feel when I read this. Carefully, I folded the letter, my vision clearing and my resolve hardening into steel. I looked up at them, they were watching me like a pack of starving dogs eyeing a man with a stake. My mother, Margaret, was the first to move. She glided over to my side of the table. Her face shifted, gone was the rage and shock, replaced by a warm, loving smile that was almost terrifying because it didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. She placed a hand on my arm, it felt like ice. Daniel, darling, she purred softly, her voice dripping with sweetness that was more poisonous than any acid. We're family, and family makes mistakes. We were just so worried about Dad. We weren't thinking clearly. This has all been a terrible misunderstanding. Surely, we can work something out and put all this ugliness behind us so we can be a family again. The woman who had lied to keep me away from my dying grandfather, who had banned me from his funeral, and who had even tried to have me legally declared a threat, she was now calling me darling. The sheer hypocrisy of it all was so staggering it nearly made me laugh out loud. I looked down at her perfectly manicured hand on my arm, then back up at her face. Family? I asked quietly but with an edge of danger in my voice. I took the letter my grandfather wrote, the one asking me to be the family's conscience, and made a decision right then and there. He had tested them and found them wanting. Now, I was going to give them one last test, a final chance to prove him wrong. Okay, I said softly, and a collective sigh of relief went through the room. My father straightened up, a smug and triumphant look already creeping back onto his face. He thought he'd won this round. But I stood up slowly and said, I'll give you a chance, my voice growing stronger as I took control of the room for the first time in my life. I'll consider helping all of you. I looked directly at my father, then added, on one condition, we'll drive to Mrs. Ramsey's house, is where I found myself now. You're going to kneel on her front porch and apologize for stealing her husband's life savings and her future. You'll make a public confession about everything you've done. I then fixed my stern gaze on my mother, and you, Mom, will go to Pastor Caldwell. This Sunday, in front of the entire church congregation, you will stand up and tell them exactly what happened to their youth center money. You will beg for their forgiveness from the bottom of your heart. I looked around at the rest of them, my so-called family, knowing they would face those they had hurt. They'd have to admit their wrongdoings, not with lawyers or excuses, but with the honest truth, and figure out how to start making amends, not with my money but with what little dignity they had left. That's what I told them, my voice ringing with a finality that even surprised me. Do all of that, I said, and then we'll discuss what comes next. The room fell into an eerie silence, the kind where you could hear a pin drop. My mother pulled her hand back sharply from my arm, as if burned. My father's face twisted, not in remorse, but pure outrage. You arrogant, self-righteous little bastard, he snarled. Who the hell do you think you are? That's what I thought, I replied softly, knowing I had my answer. My grandfather was right. They haven't changed. They never will. Their souls are already gone. I turned away from their hateful faces and looked at Mr. Whitaker, who watched me with a deep sense of approval. I had my answer now, so where do I sign? He pushed the papers toward me, a small, sad smile on his face. As I grabbed the heavy, expensive pen, the final departure began. One by one, they filed out of the room, not rushing, but like a defeated army broken in spirit, murmuring threats and curses under their breath. This wasn't the end, they'd find a way to make my life miserable. The last person to leave was my father. He paused at the door and glanced back at me with eyes full of a hatred so deep and pure it was terrifying. "You'll regret this for the rest of your life," he said. "No," I responded calmly, not looking up from the paper as I signed my name with steady resolve. "I'll regret not doing it sooner." With that, he left and the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, leaving me and Mr. Whitaker alone in that quiet, peaceful room. A week later, I wasn't sitting behind the wheel of my battered Toyota pickup anymore. Instead, I was riding shotgun in Mr. Whitaker's smooth, quiet sedan. We weren't headed to some fancy restaurant to celebrate my windfall. Instead, we were driving through a quiet suburban neighborhood toward a meeting with a man named Jonathan Liu, a forensic accountant and financial advisor who specializes in setting up and managing charitable trusts. The world had flipped upside down, but thanks to my grandfather's last letter, my priorities were crystal clear. The past week had been a surreal blur: legal paperwork, logistical tasks, emotional roller coasters, transferring titles, consolidating countless accounts, changing every lock on the house on Cedar Street. That house, my grandfather's house, was officially mine now. I'd walked through it once, the day after the will reading. The air inside was still and carried his scent: old books, pipe tobacco, peppermint. I ran my hand along his favorite leather armchair. I stood in his workshop in the basement, looking around at everything he loved. Photos lined the mantelpiece, a museum of a well-lived life. But it all felt too big, too quiet, too sacred, more his than mine. I wasn't ready to fill such a large space with my presence. So I carefully locked it all up again and went back to my small, simple apartment above my workshop. My phone kept buzzing and ringing non-stop, a relentless flood of voicemails and texts from my family, threats from my father, tearful sob stories from my mother, angry demands from Lucas, and pathetic misspelled pleas for cash from Aaron. I listened to a few of the first messages, feeling that familiar mix of anger and pity churning inside me. Then I started deleting them without even listening. They were just noise now, they had no power over me anymore. Mr. Whitaker's voice pulled me out of my thoughts. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Daniel?" he asked as he smoothly navigated through traffic. "You don't have to rush into any of this, the money isn't going anywhere. You could take some time for yourself, maybe even a vacation, you've earned it." I looked out the window at the passing scenery and replied softly, "I'm sure." This was his last wish, and honestly, it's the only part of all this that feels right or makes sense right now. The money feels more like a weight than a gift. Doing this transforms it into a tool rather than a burden. We spent 3 hours in Jonathan Liu's quiet office, minimalist but sharp as ever, with his kind eyes and mind like steel trap. He didn't offer me congratulations or treat me like I'd won the lottery. Instead, he regarded me as a client with a serious purpose. He listened carefully, jotting down notes as I explained my goal, pulling phrases directly from my grandfather's letter. I wasn't interested in simply writing a few checks to feel good about myself. I wanted to create something enduring, something with clear rules and a meaningful mission. Together, we laid the foundation for what would become the Franklin Granger Integrity Trust. Its very first non-negotiable objective was straightforward: to use the detailed records gathered by my grandfather's investigator to locate and compensate every single victim of my father's financial scams. We aimed to repay every cent they lost, along with interest calculated for the years they endured hardship. The second goal was to secure initial funding to support the creation of a local community center for veterans and their families, a project my grandfather and I had talked about for years after one of his old Army buddies had fallen on hard times. As I signed the paperwork transferring a substantial 7-figure sum from my inheritance into this new trust, I felt no regret. Instead, I experienced a deep sense of purpose. My personal bank account had taken a big hit, but the heavy burden I'd been carrying felt significantly lighter. This wasn't money to spend on fancy cars or vacations, it was a responsibility, a chance to start fresh and make things right. When I got home that evening, exhausted but clear-headed, I found a package waiting on the worn welcome mat outside my door. It was a simple shoebox-sized piece of cardboard wrapped in brown paper, with no return address, just my name and address written in a familiar, elegant, slightly shaky cursive handwriting. Instantly, I knew it was from my great Aunt Agnes. I brought it inside, sat at my small kitchen table, and carefully sliced through the tape. There was no letter inside, only items, a carefully chosen collection of memories and mementos. One was a faded photograph of my much younger grandfather, smiling brightly while holding me, then a toddler, on his broad shoulders at a noisy county fair. Another was my very first fishing lure, rusty with a small feather still attached, a dog-eared paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, the one he had given me when I turned 15. As I opened it, I saw a single passage underlined in his distinctive blue ink: "I wanted you to see what real courage is. It's not about having a gun in your hand, it's about knowing you're beaten before you even start, but going on anyway and seeing it through no matter what." At the bottom of the box, nestled in tissue paper, was a small leather-bound journal, my grandfather's, and my heart started pounding in my chest. I opened it with trembling hands. It wasn't a daily diary but rather a collection of scattered entries over the years, his thoughts on books he'd read, notes about his garden, reflections on how the world was changing. Then I found an entry dated the day after that terrible Thanksgiving, November 25th. It read, "Daniel did something brave tonight. Foolish, reckless, beautiful, brave." He held up a mirror to this family, and instead of facing their own reflection, they tried to shatter it. I could picture their faces, the guilt, the denial, and that unquenchable greed that's taken over them all. For years, I'd made excuses for Charles and Margaret, telling myself they were just weak or ambitious or flawed people. But I was wrong. They're corrupt to the core, the rot has gone to the bone. And my son Daniel, those vultures are going to make him pay for his honesty. He stood alone tonight against all of them. I watched him from the head of my table, standing there on his own. And the shame I feel for remaining silent is like a physical ache deep in my gut. That silence ends now. First thing tomorrow morning, I'm calling Whitaker. It's time to stop making excuses. It's time to protect my grandson. It's time to decide what kind of legacy I want to leave behind. And that legacy isn't this broken, greedy family, it's him, that boy. It has always been him. I closed the journal tightly against my chest, holding it close. For so long, I believed he was disappointed in me, that he thought I had failed him somehow. I thought I'd lost him forever, that he'd gone believing their lies. But he never wavered. He was secretly fighting for me all along, laying the groundwork for a battle I never saw coming. The restraining order wasn't rejection, it was the final piece of evidence he needed to show how cruel my family truly is, something the world needed to see. Sitting alone that night in my quiet apartment, I finally felt like I wasn't an orphan anymore, I felt like a son. A few days later, Aunt Agnes called me, her voice sounded frail, thin as paper over the phone. Without any greeting or preamble she asked, "Did you get the box, Daniel?" "I did," I told her, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Aunt Agnes, more than you'll ever know." "I'm so sorry, Daniel," she whispered, her voice thick with tears that I could hear clearly. "I realized I should have spoken up that night. I saw the expression on your grandfather's face, and deep down, I knew you were right. I was just too much of a coward to say anything. You did what you could, and I want you to know that I meant it when I told her. You were there, and you even sent me that box. That's not cowardice, that's kindness." Her voice grew a little stronger as she said, "Your grandfather, she told me, was so proud of you. Even when you two disagreed about your career choices, especially about not going into the family business, he always said that boy has a true north. His compass works." She paused before adding, "The rest of them? Their compass is broken and just spins around endlessly. She knew. Always knew who you truly were." We talked a bit longer. She hesitated before sharing about the family, how everything was falling apart. Charles and Margaret weren't talking anymore, Lucas had apparently moved out, leaving Jenna amidst the chaos of their marriage breakdown. They all pointed fingers at each other, drowning in their own toxicity. For a moment, I felt a fleeting spark, something like satisfaction or maybe relief, but it quickly faded into quiet, heavy pity. They'd chased after everything they thought mattered, money, status, appearances, and in the end, they had nothing to show for it. I had lost what I believed was my family, but gradually, I started to see I was gaining something far more precious, a connection to the truth, an opportunity to build a legacy based on honor, and a new community of people like me who valued integrity over inheritance. The next week, I drove to a neighborhood I didn't really know, small, tidy houses built after the war, meant for returning GIs and their young families. These were the homes of hardworking folks who paid their bills and kept to themselves. I parked my old Toyota pickup, suddenly feeling like an old friend, right in front of one of the tiniest houses on the block. The garden out front was well tended, bursting with late-blooming chrysanthemums in shades of yellow and bronze that seemed to defy the season. I walked up the short concrete path and knocked on the door. After a moment, an older woman with kind but tired eyes answered. She looked like someone who'd known hardships, her frail bones thin and bird-like. "Mrs. Ramsey," I greeted softly. "Daniel," she responded with a gentle surprise in her voice. "What on earth are you doing here, dear?" "Hello, Mrs. Ramsey," I said, offering a small, hesitant smile. "I hope I'm not bothering you. Could I come inside just for a minute? I have something for you." She motioned for me to follow her into her living room. It was small but spotless, filled with the comforting scent of lemon polish and old photographs lining every surface. Smiling from every frame were her children and grandchildren. On the mantelpiece was a framed photo of her and her late husband on their wedding day, young and glowing with happiness. Next to it was another picture that made my stomach tighten, the two of them standing beside my father, all smiling for the camera. That photo was from before everything changed, before the investment disaster. We sat down on her floral-patterned sofa, and I didn't bother with small talk anymore. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a long, formal envelope, handing it to her. "This is because of my father, Charles," I said firmly. "And because of my grandfather, Franklin." I looked directly at her and explained, "Mrs. Ramsey, my grandfather knew what my father did to you and Mr. Ramsey. He was heartbroken and ashamed of it all. Before he passed away, he made it his greatest wish to try and make things right." She stared at the official-looking envelope then back at me, confusion softening her eyes. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Just open it," I urged gently. Her hands trembled slightly as she slipped her finger under the flap and pulled out the check inside. Her eyes widened as she stared at it, she couldn't believe what she saw. She looked at the number written on the pay line, then back at me in disbelief, as if her own eyes were deceiving her. It was a cashier's check from the newly established Franklin Granger Integrity Trust Fund, covering every penny they had lost in my father's scheme plus a generous interest calculation over the years. It was enough to pay off that crushing reverse mortgage weighing down her shoulders and gave her a chance to live with dignity without fear for the rest of her life. Tears welled up silently and heavy as they traced down her lined cheeks. She began to cry softly but uncontrollably. "I can't possibly take this," she whispered urgently, trying to hand it back to me. "Please," I said softly but with emotion thick in my voice as I gently stopped her hand from returning it. "You have to take it. This isn't from me, it's from my grandfather. This is what he wanted to give you. This is his true legacy." Finally, she looked up at me through tears that shimmered with gratitude, a watery smile breaking through, and in that moment, her face seemed to lighten, making her look years younger than she had in years past. "Your grandfather was a truly good man," she said with sincerity. "A genuinely kind person, and you're just like him, Daniel, you have his eyes." We stayed there a little longer, and she started sharing stories about my grandfather, little, funny anecdotes I'd never heard before. When I finally left her house, I felt lighter than I ever had in my entire life. All the worries about money, the house, and family drama faded into the background. What mattered now was real, what was right. As I headed home, my phone suddenly buzzed with a message from an unknown number. For a moment, my stomach clenched up, the old reflex kicked in, and I almost thought it was one of those previous harassers starting a new round. I nearly hit delete without even opening it, but something told me to read it instead. The message said, "This is Emily Ramsey. My mom just called me and told me what you did. I don't even know what to say. My dad, he would have just thanked you from the bottom of his heart. Thank you." I pulled my truck over to the side of the road, letting the late afternoon sun warm my face through the windshield. My mind went back to my grandfather's words from that video, the one where he called me the only one in the family with a soul. I had thought he was just being kind, trying to make me feel better, but maybe, just maybe, he was onto something. Maybe I hadn't really lost a family, instead, I'd been freed from a bunch of toxic relatives. And in doing that, I was discovering a new family, a new community, not one based on bloodlines but on shared decency, on fixing wrongs, and on the quiet, lasting legacy of a good and honorable man. The road ahead still felt new and a little uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, I genuinely felt like I was finally heading in the right direction. Thanks for listening to my story. I hope it struck a chord with you somehow. It's been a wild ride, and sharing it helps me process everything. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to stand up for what was right, even if it meant going it alone? I'd really like to hear about it. Please share your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.